When I was raising my children, I read a lot of books on parenting and attended workshops and classes. I tried many parenting techniques, and I actually felt like most of what I learned was valuable, and most of the techniques worked and made life easier for a while. Parenting got much harder when my children's father took his life. My children were 16, 14, 12, and 5 years old at the time. Everyone was struggling at once. My oldest son started gravitating from his old friends to new friends who didn't appear as stable. Another child started having more girls over. Another began having unexplained aches and pains. And another son started getting into trouble at school. During this difficult time, I learned how trauma can greatly affect children's behavior. The other thing I learned was just how unique every child is. Most children will have some behavior problems after big changes or traumatic events. But what about those children who don't really seem to be going through any trauma, but seem to struggle when even minor challenges present themselves? As a parent, this can make it feel like you have no clue what you're doing. And in my case, I felt like I had lost my ability to parent. There are a few lessons I learned during this time that I think would benefit any parent. The first thing I learned was that in really any relationship, I want my number one focus to be connection. As I look back, I think I would have had more connection with my children if I had talked less and listened more. As a parent, it's so easy to go into lecture mode. It's important, and we have a responsibility to teach our children correct principles, teach them how to be respectful and considerate and kind. But I can also be so long winded at times. My child might ask me a simple question, and instead of offering a simple answer, I would often go into long explanations and give my child way more information than they asked for. We probably all know someone who we hesitate to begin a conversation with because you know how much they like to talk. Often we will distance ourselves and sometimes even avoid these people. We don't want our children to feel this way. If we keep answers short and sweet, they will be more willing to ask us questions in the future. The other way to build connection is to be vulnerable. As a parent, I want to be an example. I wanted my children to think I had all the answers and never made mistakes. I wanted to be the perfect mom. Of course, that's impossible because there's no such thing as a perfect parent, but I tried to appear that way to my children. I remember driving my son to a soccer practice one day and him asking me if I had ever done anything wrong. He told me he didn't feel like he could really talk to me because I didn't know what it was like to do things wrong. That's when I realized I had done myself and my children a great disfavor. Because I had always put up a front and didn't show my kids just how imperfect I was, my children didn't see me as being approachable or someone who would understand what they're going through. This facade of perfectionism made my children feel distant from me and like I would never be able to relate to them. Up to that point, I had never really shared times in my past when I had made mistakes and even sinned while growing up. My son was really surprised when I shared some of the experiences from my past and the things I had done. Being able to talk to him about repentance and forgiveness in such a personal way brought so much feelings of closeness between he and I. I wish I'd been more vulnerable sooner, admitting that I was imperfect. And I wish that I'd let my children know that even parents make mistakes. Because I wanted to appear perfect, I realized it was very seldom that I apologized. That wasn't being a good example. I wish I had apologized more. Another thing I think would have helped them enormously that ties in with being vulnerable would have been to not hide my emotions. Another way I tried to be the perfect parent was to always appear happy and excited about life. Even after their father died, I would only cry in my room. I was afraid that they would worry if they saw me distressed or if I allowed them to see me sad or mad. It probably was very disconcerting to them when they had a bad day and felt like crying or were anxious or upset. I imagine they probably felt like they were doing something wrong or shouldn't feel anything but happiness because that's how they always saw me. I wish I had known then what I know now, that vulnerability builds connection. The second thing I want to talk about is direction. Children need boundaries, guidelines, and rules in order to feel safe and secure. I feel like I established those in our family, but where I lacked was teaching them the reasons why we felt the traditions we established in our home were important and why we established the rules and boundaries that we had. Often, as parents, we tell our children not to look at pornography, not to lie or take drugs, but we don't tell them why. Our children often don't see the real harm and aren't able to look down the road and see the consequences or long-term effects of these decisions. When we don't show them the whole picture, it's hard for them to understand why we encourage them to do or not do certain things. I wish I would have had more open discussions with them, asked their opinions, and asked them more questions to get them to think more for themselves and form their own opinions. My children have told me that if they had understood why some traditions were important to me and why boundaries and rules had been established in our home, they would have been more willing to participate and obey without resentment. Often our children have their own opinions they want to share, but often don't feel like they can. They need to feel like their opinions matter and that it's okay for them to feel differently than we do in order for them to feel like they are safe to talk to us about anything. The last subject I want to discuss is correction. It's last because I believe that correction is only really successful after connection and direction have been established. When a child feels cared about and loved and feels like they have a voice and we want to hear what they have to say, and when they know why rules and boundaries are important for a family to run smoothly, then often children will respond better during those times when correction is needed. Having said that, it's important to remember that there is only so much a parent can do. We can say and do all the right things, but if our child decides that they don't want to feel connected or feel like they know more than we do and choose not to listen to a word we say, there's nothing we can do about that. What I constantly have to remind myself is that the only person I can control is myself. I remember learning this lesson when my children were still really young on one winter afternoon. My children loved to play outside, and I loved watching them have fun in the outdoors. So my children would go out and play for hours in the snow in the morning, and then they'd come in and have lunch. But the amount of time it took us to eat lunch was not enough time for their little gloves to dry out. We didn't have a lot of money at that time, but I couldn't stand to put wet gloves on my children in the afternoon, knowing their little hands would be cold. So I decided to buy an extra pair of gloves for each of them. I was so excited the day after I bought the gloves because I assumed each child would be so grateful and happy that they now had a nice new warm set of gloves for the winter afternoon adventures in the snow. I got out the new gloves and began helping my oldest son, who was probably no older than 3, put his gloves on, and he said, "I don't want those. I want my other gloves." And he pointed to the wet ones laying on the floor. I said, "Oh, no, you don't. These new gloves are nice and warm. Those other gloves will make your hands cold. Look how nice these are. They will be so much better than your cold, wet gloves." But my son was having none of it. I think I sat there arguing with a 3-year-old for at least 15 minutes. I tried making him put them on. I tried every mode of persuasion. I even resorted to bribery, but he was determined to wear the wet gloves. I wanted to control him and tell him he couldn't go out and play unless he'd put on the nice warm gloves. I felt like I wanted to force him. But the more I tried to control and force him, the more stubborn he became. Finally, I threw up my hands and said, "Fine, put on your wet gloves and just have cold hands then." I remember him looking at me and then saying, "I think I want the dry ones now." This was such an important lesson for me to learn. No one likes to feel like they're being manipulated or controlled, not even a 3-year-old. As soon as I allowed him to make his own decision, and when he felt he had agency, then he was able to really decide for himself what he really wanted. As a parent, it can be really difficult to figure out when correction is needed, which battles we want to fight, and what rules to set, and then what to do when those rules are broken. For me, there was a lot of trial and error, but I'm so grateful for all my children and what they have taught me and continue to teach me about connection, direction, and correction. Know that you are loved, and thanks for listening. If you have a child who's struggling and would like to talk to someone, don't hesitate to reach out. To schedule a free coaching session, go to cindyallredcoaching.com.